Okay, so I'm going to talk about the robustness of online auditory data. And this is something that Nadine has touched on, and I'll just expand on a couple points and some background involving my own data. So we know that testing online is easy and fast, but the inherited wisdom that we have as a field is that auditory research needs to be difficult and slow. And so a lot of times it's difficult to get papers published, at least in my experience, because there's sometimes concerns raised about the robustness of online data, questions raised about headphones, background noise, and these are legitimate concerns, I think. And so a lot of people want to know, are online data, auditory data, robust? Well, how do we know if they're robust? Well, if online experiments are robust, then the data should be reliable. They should be internally consistent, and we can measure that in our tasks. The data should replicate, so we should get similar results if we are doing the experiments in the lab or online. And we should be able to correlate our measures with other variables that our measures should correlate with, just as if you would with any other experiment that was with data collected inside the lab. So I will just go through a couple example studies and illustrate some points relating to data quality and reliability and replicability and correlations with other tasks. And just to show how we've gone about this in our lab, just ensuring that the data we collect online are robust. Okay, so here's an example study. So just some background information, and many of you auditory researchers will know this, of course, but communicative signals like speech and music are made up of auditory dimensions that vary over time, such as pitch, amplitude, and the duration of individual elements. And these vary and give rise to categorical perception. So this is how we can decide, where a word begins and ends. We can decide which word is emphasized in a sentence. We know when musical phrases begin and end, and so on. And as the Yanni Laurel experience taught us, not everyone comes to has the same opinion about how to categorize sensory input. So this was something that circulated around Twitter and around the internets for a while, where there was a particular sound recording that some people heard as Yanni and some people heard as Laurel. And if you're not familiar with that, you're at least familiar with the dress, which was either yellow or blue, and some people saw it as one color or the other. So why do we arrive at these different categorical judgments for the same sensory input? Well, we've looked at one aspect of this in our lab, namely that auditory experience can affect weighting in terms of auditory perception. And so we test the hypothesis that, that individuals who have extensive experience with a pitch and attending to pitch in their native language might rely more on pitch in their judgments when they're processing other domains. And so we recruited 45 Mandarin speakers online. These were not recruited through a recruitment platform. These were people who were from the London Mandarin Chinese speaking community, along with 45 English speaking controls and 27 Spanish speaking controls. And we ended up recruiting, fortunately, 14 Mandarin speakers who did the task in the lab. And this ended up being really important, because this is something we were asked about in review, like how do you know your data are looking the same as if you had collected them in the lab. And so we had this comparison set that we could use. So just to give you an idea of the task, this was the stimulus space that we used. So this was made of two spoken phrases. So the phrase study music with emphasis on study, and study music with emphasis on music. And we varied the degree to which either pitch cues or duration cues indicated one interpretation or the other. So in the bottom left and the top right corner of the space, these stimuli were unambiguous. They were, the cues were congruent. And in the top left and the bottom right corners, the cues conflicted. So pitch gave one interpretation, but duration gave another. And so we predicted that the Mandarin speakers, because they have all this experience attending to pitch, they would base their judgments on pitch. And so this is what we found for both English speech and musical beats. So the Mandarin speakers tended to go with the pitch-based interpretation, whereas the English and Spanish groups tended to go with duration-based. Okay, so now here is what you're probably actually interested in. So the in-lab versus online data, which are very similar. So what I would draw your attention to here is the blue line is the English speakers, and the yellow and the red lines are the data from the Mandarin speaker. And so this is data from these different categorization tasks collapsed over either the pitch dimension or the duration dimension. And as you can see, the data collected online and in the lab are extremely similar. Nadine mentioned a bit about data quality and exclusions. And so this is something that I think is really important. We set, to ensure we got good data, we set an a priori exclusion criteria. So these Q weights that we're measuring, so the degree to which people use pitch or duration, are just logistic regression coefficients in our study. And so each one is associated with the p-value in the model. And if a participant is basing their judgments on one of these dimensions or the other or both, then these p-values should be significant. But if there's basically no effect of our stimulus manipulation on judgments, then we know that the participant is probably either not doing the task or they can't hear the stimuli or something has gone wrong and we don't want their data. And so we set this as an exclusion criterion beforehand, and we're able to weed out the people who could not do the task for one reason or another. I'll just talk a bit about reliability. So to make sure our task was internally consistent, and this is something we were actually asked about in review, so it was easy enough to do this. We just did a simple split half reliability. So we took the judgments in these Q weighting studies and we split the trials into two halves. And we did this over and over again through 100 iterations. And we calculated the Q weights in each half of the data and correlated the first half with the second half. And reliability was very high. So this is just the online data I'm showing you now. And you can see that the Pearson R's reliability values are all in the 90s, which is very good. So I've talked about the fact that online experiments are reliable. They seem to be reliable. They do replicate. At least in our lab, we've been able to replicate paradigms done outside the, we've been able to replicate in-lab and out-of-lab data. But do online data correlate with other measures? And this is something that is always desirable if you can find something, another measure in the real world as a sort of reality check that your data are related to. And so I'll just talk about a second study in which we've looked at this question. So congenital amusia is also known as tone deafness, and this is a selective impairment for pitch processing. And so we gave these amusic individuals a Q weighting task. And so with the Mandarin speakers, we had hypothesized that they would rely more on pitch, and when cues conflicted, they would go with a pitch-based interpretation. We hypothesized that the amusics would go with the duration-based interpretation in downweight pitch. And this is what we found. Amusics had larger duration weights than pitch weights. And when stimuli were ambiguous or when cues conflicted, they tended to go with a duration-based cue rather than the pitch-based cue. Okay, and so we were able to, so we measured these Q weights under careful conditions. Each one of these Q weighting experiments, by the way, is about 500 trials. So it's a lot of categorization judgments. And we correlated the Q weights with psychophysics that we measured in the laboratory under very careful conditions. And we found that the individuals who had finer pitch perception relative to duration perception had higher pitch relative to duration Q weights. And with these amusic individuals, we tested them on a speech perception paradigm in the scanner and identified pitch sensitive cortex and a region in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that was integrated in terms of functional connectivity with the right hemisphere auditory cortex, and found that connectivity varied across all of our participants. So individuals with stronger pitch Q weights had stronger connectivity between pitch related processing regions and left hemisphere frontal areas. So I've shown that, at least in our experience, online auditory experiments are reliable. The data do replicate between in-lab and out-of-lab. And we've been able to correlate the results of online studies with other measures that we've collected. So I'll just leave you with some final thoughts. Online seems to be the new normal, and it seems like the that we should just embrace that fact. And in terms of ecological validity, basically this is valid. This is how people talk now. So I don't think the field should be afraid to embrace that fact. It's not that everyone is listening to sounds in quiet environments like we are talking through microphones and headsets, and it's important to study speech perception, auditory perception generally in that context. All the same, there's going to be some skepticism about whether you can do auditory research online because it's very new. And the burden is on auditory researchers like us to show everyone that, look, it's fine. So as Nadeed mentioned, there are ways where you can, to check whether your data are valid. I've gone through some descriptions of how we've looked at reliability and replication. And so I think these are things we should try to put in our manuscripts at first submission if possible, rather than wait for a reviewer to say, hey, but wait a minute, you did this online, I don't believe it. So try to reassure your readers and reviewers that everything is fine. And thanks, that's all I had today. So yeah, good to be here and good luck with your experiments.